The mortar and pestle made a sound like teeth on bone, because that's precisely what it was. 3 o'clock in the morning, and Alfred Thorne stood in the basement kitchen of the Blackridge estate, grinding death into powder. The porcelain bowl before him had once held Mistress Temperance's French face cream, imported at great expense from Paris. Now it cradled something far more precious, the pulverized remains of Charleston's forgotten dead. The bone fragment between pestle and mortar disintegrated slowly, reluctantly, as if the calcium itself remembered what it meant to be human. Alfred pressed harder. The grinding sound echoed through the brick-vaulted basement, a rhythmic whisper that seemed to say justice, justice, justice with each circular motion. His hands were steady. They had been steady for 43 years, through beatings, through humiliations, through the day they told him his daughter Mercy had simply stopped breathing in the cotton fields, worked to nothing, collapsed between the rows like a broken doll. His hands had been steady even then, when he'd wanted to wrap them around Cornelius Blackridge's throat and squeeze until those pale blue eyes bulged from their sockets. But a slave who raises his hand to his master doesn't live long enough to regret it. So Alfred had kept his hand steady, his face blank, his voice soft and deferential. And he had waited. The bone ash was fine as talcum now, white and pure and terrible. He tipped it into the porcelain bowl, where it joined the powder he'd been collecting for 3 months. Since Mercy's death. Since they'd buried her in the slave cemetery beyond the Magnolia Grove, in unmarked ground that would be plowed over and forgotten within a generation. No headstone. No prayer. Just the overseer's boot kicking dirt onto her wrapped body while Alfred stood 10 paces back, forbidden even to say goodbye. He had gone to the cemetery that night with a spade and a lantern. The earth there was soft, turned over so many times it barely resisted. How many bodies lay beneath those twisted oaks? 50. 100. The Blackridge family had owned this land for 3 generations, and enslaved people died here the way they died everywhere in the South, quietly, numerously, unmourned except by those who would never be allowed to mourn aloud. Alfred had chosen carefully. Not Mercy, he couldn't bear to disturb her rest. But beside her grave, the earth had settled over someone else's bones. Someone old, he thought, from how deep he'd had to dig. The skeleton had been intact, mostly. He'd selected a femur, the largest bone, heavy with the weight of a lifetime. He'd cleaned it in the creek, dried it in the sun, and brought it home in pieces over several weeks, hidden in the pockets of his livery coat. Now that bone was powder. Anonymous. Untraceable. Ready. The grandfather clock in the hall above him chimed 3:30. Alfred moved with practiced efficiency, replacing the lid on the porcelain bowl and tucking it behind the flour sacks where no one would think to look. He washed the mortar and pestle in the basin, dried them, and returned them to their usual place on the shelf. He laid kindling in the great cooking hearth, struck flint to steel, and coaxed flame from tinder. The kitchen began to warm. In 2 hours, the other house servants would arrive to begin their day. In 3 hours, the Blackridge family would descend for breakfast, and Alfred would serve them with the same impeccable grace he displayed for 23 years. But today would be different. Today, they would begin to pay. If you're enjoying this descent into darkness, subscribe to stay updated on more macabre tales from history. Drop a comment below, would you have suspected the truth? The morning routine was ritual, sacred in its repetition. Alfred moved through it like a priest at the altar, each gesture precise and meaningful. He prepared the sideboard in the breakfast room while the other servants bustled in the kitchen, Delilah at the stove, Josiah hauling water, young Ruth polishing silver with fierce concentration. None of them knew. None of them could know. This was Alfred's burden alone, his terrible secret, his quiet war. He knew the Blackridge family's preferences as intimately as he knew his own heartbeat. Master Cornelius took his coffee black with 2 sugars, his eggs soft-boiled, his bacon crisp. Mistress Temperance preferred tea with cream and honey, toast with marmalade, nothing too heavy lest it spoil her delicate constitution. Zebediah, their eldest, would eat anything put before him as long as it was drowned in butter and followed by whiskey. Eulalie picked at her food like a bird, forever concerned about her waistline, forever worried what Charleston society would say. And Thaddeus, the youngest at 16, actually said please and thank you, actually looked Alfred in the eye when he spoke, which somehow made everything worse. The breakfast menu today included cream of parsnip soup, Mistress Temperance's favorite, a recipe from her grandmother, meant to be delicate and refined. Alfred had suggested it 3 days prior, and cook had been delighted by his thoughtfulness. "You always remember what pleases them," she'd said, smiling. If she only knew. He watched through the kitchen doorway as Delilah stirred the soup, her broad back bent over the pot, humming a spirit under her breath. The soup was perfect, silky, aromatic, seasoned with nutmeg and white pepper. When she turned away to fetch the cream, Alfred moved. His hand slipped into his pocket, withdrew a small twist of paper no larger than a thimble. Inside, bone ash, measured precisely, enough to sicken but not to kill. Not yet. This was a long game, a slow poisoning that would look like any of a dozen mysterious ailments that plagued the South. Swamp fever. Consumption. The vapors. The ash dissolved into the soup without a trace, stirred in with 3 swift motions of the ladle. White into white. Death into sustenance. Alfred's face remained perfectly neutral, his breathing calm. When Delilah returned with the cream, he had already stepped away, was already arranging the breakfast rolls in their silver basket. "That smells divine," he said pleasantly. "The family will be so pleased." Delilah beamed. "I do hope so. The mistress has been so particular lately." "She'll be more particular soon," Alfred thought. "When her stomach cramps. When her head pounds. When she wonders what invisible curse has fallen upon this house." The clock struck 6. Above, he heard the familiar sounds of the Blackridge family waking, footsteps on hardwood, doors opening and closing, Mistress Temperance's voice calling for her lady's maid. The manor came alive the way it did every morning, all polished elegance and casual cruelty, a machine of refinement built on the backs of people who would never taste its fruits. Alfred climbed the servants' stairs to the breakfast room and began laying the table. Irish linen. English china. Silver forks with the Blackridge crest. He positioned each element with geometric precision, creating a tableau of civilization that would make the family feel sophisticated, important, deserving of their station. The soup tureen went in the center, still steaming, the bone ash within it completely invisible. Cornelius Blackridge entered first, as he always did, moving with the ponderous confidence of a man who'd never been told no in his entire life. He was 52, thick around the middle, with matonchop sideburns gone gray and a face that was handsome in the way expensive cuts of meat were handsome, well-marbled and deeply satisfied with itself. He owned 400 acres and 63 human beings, and he considered himself a benevolent master because he'd never personally wielded the whip. "Good morning, Alfred," Cornelius said, settling into his chair at the head of the table. He didn't look at Alfred when he spoke. Masters rarely did. "Good morning, Master Blackridge." Alfred's voice was modulated, pleasant, empty of everything he felt. "I trust you slept well." "Well enough. Damned mockingbird kept me up half the night." "Have Josiah deal with it." "Of course, sir." "Deal with it." As if Josiah had nothing better to do than murder songbirds to ensure Cornelius's comfort. But Alfred merely nodded and poured the coffee, 2 sugars, exactly as preferred. The rest of the family trickled in. Temperance with her elaborate morning dress and her pinched expression. Zebediah reeked of last night's whiskey and something fouler, something Alfred recognized as guilt, though Zebediah himself seemed constitutionally incapable of that emotion. Eulalie in pink silk, already corseted so tightly she could barely breathe. And finally Thaddeus, looking tired and unusually pale, offered Alfred a small smile that cut deeper than any insult. "Shall I serve the soup?" Alfred asked. "Yes, yes," Cornelius said, unfolding his napkin. "And be quick about it. I have business in town at 9. Alfred lifted the tureen. The soup within was beautiful, creamy white with flecks of green parsley, completely unaware of what it carried. He ladled it into Cornelius's bowl first, master of the house, master of all he surveyed, master of nothing when the bone ash reached his stomach and began its work. "Smells wonderful," Cornelius said, lifting his spoon. Alfred stood at attention, hands clasped behind his back, face a mask of servile attentiveness. Inside his chest, his heart was a fist. Inside his mind, he saw Mercy's face the last time he'd been allowed to see her alive, hollow-eyed, too thin, coughing blood into a rag she tried to hide from him. He saw the overseer's boot pushing dirt onto her body. He saw Zebediah walking past the slave quarters late at night, drunk and leering. He saw 23 years of invisible violence, of casual destruction, of lives treated like fodder. Cornelius brought the spoon to his lips. He sipped. He swallowed. Delicious, he pronounced, and took another spoonful. My compliments to cook. I shall relay your satisfaction, sir, Alfred said softly. The rest of the family began to eat. Spoonful after spoonful. Death sliding down their throats with every swallow, elegant and refined and completely unsuspected. Alfred watched them eat the way a man watches a prayer come true, with something too dark to be called hope but too fervent to be called anything else. Outside, a mockingbird sang in the magnolia trees. The morning sun slanted through the tall windows, painting everything gold. The Blackridge family continued their breakfast, laughing at some joke Zebediah told, completely unaware that their butler stood behind them with steady hands and a heart full of ashes. 3 months since Mercy died. 3 months of grinding bones in the dark. And now, finally, the accounting has begun. The Blackridge estate sprawled across 400 acres of South Carolina lowcountry like a monument to everything beautiful and rotten in the American South. Live oaks draped in Spanish moss formed a quarter-mile avenue leading to the main house, their branches meeting overhead to create a tunnel of dappled shadow that made visitors feel they were entering something sacred. The mansion itself rose 3 stories of whitewashed brick and Corinthian columns, its double-gallery piazzas catching the breeze that rolled in from the Ashley River. Formal gardens stretched behind the house, boxwood mazes and rose arbors and a fountain imported from Italy, where marble cherubs eternally poured water from marble urns. It was the sort of place that appeared in Harper's weekly illustrations, captioned as, "The Grace of Southern Living." What those illustrations never showed were the quarters, 2 rows of wooden cabins behind the cotton gin, where 63 human beings lived in conditions that would shame a stable master. They never showed the whipping post near the overseer's house, its wood stained dark from years of use. They never showed the small cemetery beyond the Magnolia Grove, where the dead were buried quickly and cheaply, their names forgotten before the earth had settled over them. Alfred knew every inch of this property. He had spent 23 years learning its rhythms, its secrets, its carefully maintained illusions. He knew which floorboards creaked in the upstairs hallway. He knew where Cornelius hid his account books, filled with neat columns that reduced human lives to assets and depreciation. He knew that Temperance took laudanum every night and that Zebediah kept a pistol under his pillow and that Eulalie cried herself to sleep more often than not, though she died before admitting why. He knew all of this, and he used it. The morning after the first poisoning passed without incident. Cornelius went to town to meet with his cotton factor. Temperance received callers in the parlor, serving tea and gossip in equal measure. Zebediah rode out to inspect the fields with the overseer, ostensibly to ensure the spring planting was proceeding correctly, though Alfred suspected he was actually sleeping off his hangover in the shade of a cotton shed. Eulalie practiced piano in the music room, her fingers stumbling over a Chopin nocturne she'd been working on for months. And Thaddeus spent the afternoon in the library, reading medical texts borrowed from his tutor, occasionally looking up to stare out the window at nothing in particular. Alfred moved among them like a ghost, silent and essential, always present but never truly seen. He brought Temperance her afternoon sherry. He helped Cornelius into his riding coat. He retrieved Eulalie's sheet music when it slipped from the piano bench. And when Thaddeus asked if he might have some lemonade, Alfred prepared it with the same careful attention he gave everything else, though this time, he added nothing more sinister than sugar and fresh mint from the kitchen garden. Thaddeus had always been the complication. The others were easy to hate with the pure, clean hatred that sustained Alfred through his darkest hours. But Thaddeus had been 7 years old when Alfred arrived at Blackridge, a sickly child prone to fevers and nightmares, and he had attached himself to Alfred with the blind trust children have before the world teaches them cruelty. He had asked Alfred questions about everything: why did birds sing, where did storms come from, what happened to people after they died? And Alfred, despite knowing better, despite knowing that kindness toward a master's child was a weakness he couldn't afford, had answered honestly. Now Thaddeus was 16, still sickly, still thoughtful, still treating Alfred like a human being rather than a piece of furniture. It would have been easier if he were like Zebediah, cruel and stupid and deserving of every drop of bone ash Alfred could feed him. But life, Alfred had learned, was rarely easy. By evening, the first symptoms appeared. Dinner was at 7 o'clock, as it had been for as long as Alfred could remember. The family gathered in the dining room, where crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across mahogany furniture that had belonged to Cornelius's grandfather. Alfred and 2 other house servants, Delilah and young Ruth, served the meal in courses: turtle soup, roasted duck with orange glaze, creamed spinach, sweet potatoes candied with molasses, buttermilk biscuits still warm from the oven, and for dessert, a charlotte russe that Temperance had specifically requested. Alfred had added bone ash to the turtle soup. Just a pinch, stirred into the tureen before it left the kitchen. Not enough to taste. Never enough to taste. Cornelius ate heartily, as he always did, pausing between bites to lecture his children on the cotton market and the incompetence of northern abolitionists. Temperance picked at her food, as she always did, more interested in maintaining her waistline than nourishing her body. Zebediah consumed everything in reach, shoveling food into his mouth with the manners of a hog at a trough. Eulalie ate precisely 3 bites of each course, arranged her silverware at perfect angles, and spent most of the meal pushing food around her plate to create the illusion of appetite. And Thaddeus, Alfred noticed, barely touched the soup. He took 2 spoonfuls, then set down his spoon and focused on the duck instead. A cold finger of worry traced down Alfred's spine. Has the boy noticed something? Could he somehow taste the poison? Not hungry, Thaddeus? Temperance asked, eyeing her youngest with concern. You look pale. I'm fine, mother. Just not particularly fond of turtle soup. Since when? Cornelius demanded. You've always liked it. Perhaps my tastes are changing. Thaddeus offered a weak smile. I'm growing up, after all. Zebediah snorted. Growing up would require you to develop some backbone. Perhaps if you spent less time with books and more time learning to manage the property. That's enough, Cornelius said, though his tone suggested he agreed with the sentiment. Thaddeus will find his place in due time. Alfred refilled water glasses and removed empty plates, his face carefully neutral. But his mind was racing. If Thaddeus had indeed noticed something wrong with the soup, if he began to refuse food, it would draw attention. Questions would be asked. The careful balance Alfred had constructed might collapse. Halfway through the main course, Cornelius set down his fork and pressed a hand to his stomach. I seem to have developed the most peculiar cramp, he said, frowning. Perhaps that turtle was off. The turtle was perfectly fresh, sir, Alfred said immediately. I selected it myself this morning from Brennan's market. Nevertheless, I feel distinctly unwell. Cornelius pushed back from the table. Temperance, perhaps you should summon Dr. Fenwick in the morning if this persists. It's probably just indigestion, dear, Temperance said, though Alfred noticed she too had gone pale, one hand resting on her own midsection. I feel a bit queasy myself. Perhaps we both need a dose of calomel. Zebediah belched loudly. I feel fine. You're both just getting old. But by the time dessert was served, Zebediah's confident grin had faded. He excused himself from the table with unusual haste, mumbling something about needing fresh air. Through the tall windows, Alfred watched him stumble to the garden and vomit into the rose bushes, his broad shoulders heaving. 3 out of 4. Only Thaddeus remained untouched, and only because he'd barely eaten the soup. Alfred cleared the table with meticulous care, carrying dishes to the kitchen while inside his chest, something dark and satisfied began to unfurl. It was working. The first dose had been small, a test, really, to see if they would notice, if their bodies would immediately reject the poison. But they hadn't noticed. They'd eaten death with the same casual entitlement they ate everything else, and now their bodies were beginning to rebel. In the kitchen, Delilah was washing dishes while Ruth dried them, both women gossiping about the garden party Temperance was planning for next month. She wants 300 roses, Ruth was saying, her eyes wide. 300. Where does she think we'll find 300 roses? She thinks we'll find them because we always find what she wants, Delilah replied, scrubbing a plate with unnecessary force. That woman could ask for the moon and expect us to fetch a ladder. Alfred said nothing, merely set down the dishes he'd carried from the dining room and turned to leave. But Delilah caught his arm. Alfred? Is the family all right? Master Cornelius looked poorly when you brought those plates down. A touch of dyspepsia, I believe, Alfred said smoothly. Nothing serious. The turtle soup may have been too rich. But I made that soup the same way I always do, Delilah said, her brow furrowing with concern. You don't think? I think the master simply overindulged, Alfred interrupted gently. You know how he is. Never met a meal he couldn't consume twice over. Delilah relaxed slightly, though worry still creased her face. "I suppose you're right. Still, I hope they don't blame me if they're truly ill." "They won't," Alfred assured her, though he felt a pang of guilt. Delilah had cooked for the Blackridge family for 15 years. If suspicion fell anywhere, it would fall on the kitchen, and she would bear the brunt of it. But what choice did he have? Mercy was dead. Justice was a luxury slaves couldn't afford through legal channels. So Alfred would provide justice through other means. Upstairs, the house had grown quiet. Alfred made his rounds, ensuring all the lamps were extinguished, all the doors locked, all the windows secured against the night. He paused outside Cornelius's bedroom and heard retching from within, followed by Temperance's voice offering comfort in tones sharp with annoyance. Down the hall, Zebediah's room was silent, probably passed out drunk and sick, though he'd never admit the sick part. Eulalie's door was closed, a sliver of lamplight visible beneath it. And Thaddeus sat in the library still, curled in a leather chair with a medical text open on his lap, looking thoughtful and troubled. Alfred watched him for a moment through the half-open door. The boy's finger traced the words on the page, his lips moving silently as he read. What was he studying? Poisons, perhaps. Symptoms of mysterious illnesses. Or was Alfred simply seeing conspiracy where none existed? Alfred? Thaddeus looked up suddenly, catching him in the doorway. Is father all right? I heard he was sick. I believe it was something he ate, Alfred said carefully. Nothing to worry about, Master Thaddeus. A night's rest will set him right. Thaddeus studied him with those two intelligent eyes, and for a moment, Alfred wondered if the boy could see straight through him, could see the bone ash and the grinding stone and the cemetery dirt under his fingernails. But then Thaddeus simply nodded and returned to his book. Good night, Alfred. Good night, Master Thaddeus. Alfred descended to his small room off the kitchen, little more than a closet with a cot and a wash basin, but it was his, the only private space he'd been allowed in 23 years. He sat on the edge of the cot and removed his shoes, his body aching with the particular exhaustion that came from maintaining perfect posture and perfect deference for 16 hours straight. From his pocket, he withdrew the twist of paper containing tonight's unused portion of bone ash. There was still so much left. Months' worth, if he was careful. Enough to sicken them slowly, to make them suffer the way Mercy had suffered, wasting away over weeks until there was nothing left but skin stretched over bone and eyes that had stopped hoping for mercy. Outside his small window, moonlight illuminated the magnolia grove. Beyond it, invisible in darkness, lay the cemetery. Mercy's grave. All the other graves. All the bones are still in the ground, waiting. Alfred lay down on his cot and closed his eyes. Tomorrow, he will grind more bones. Tomorrow, he would add more ash to their food. Tomorrow, the Blackridge family would eat their slow death with silver spoons and crystal glasses, and they would never know that their trusted butler, invisible, essential, utterly beneath their notice, was the instrument of their destruction. Tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after, until justice was served. By the end of the first week, the Blackridge household had descended into a peculiar kind of chaos, the sort that afflicted wealthy families unaccustomed to genuine suffering. Cornelius had taken to his bed on the third day, complaining of relentless stomach cramps that no amount of laudanum seemed to ease. Temperance developed a persistent headache that made her snap at the servants like a wounded animal. Zebediah, ever the stubborn fool, insisted he was perfectly fine even as he vomited behind the stables 3 times before noon. Only Eulalie and Thaddeus seemed relatively untouched, though Eulalie had begun to look hollower somehow, her fine-boned face taking on a gaunt quality that made her resemble a porcelain doll left too long in the sun. Alfred moved through this new landscape of suffering with practiced efficiency, his face arranged in an expression of concern that bordered on perfection. He brought cold compresses for Temperance's head. He helped Cornelius to the chamber pot when the cramps grew too severe. He held basins while Zebediah retched and pretended not to hear the curses the young master spat between heaves. And through it all, he continued to add bone ash to their meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, each portion carefully measured to maintain the illusion of natural illness without tipping into obvious poisoning. The family physician, Dr. Ambrose Fenwick, arrived on the 5th day. He was a portly man of 60 with whiskers that reminded Alfred of a walrus and the kind of confidence that came from decades of being wrong but never held accountable. He examined Cornelius first, pressing on his abdomen and asking questions about bowel movements with the clinical detachment of someone discussing crop yields. Alfred stood in a corner of the bedroom, hands clasped, invisible as always. He watched Dr. Fenwick prod and ponder, watched him pull out various instruments from his black leather bag, a stethoscope, a tongue depressor, small vials of mysterious liquids. Most peculiar, Dr. Fenwick muttered, straightening up. Your pulse is erratic, your color is poor. Tell me, Cornelius, have you been exposed to any unusual substances? Chemicals, perhaps, from the cotton gin? Nothing out of the ordinary, Cornelius groaned, his face slick with sweat despite the cool morning air. I feel as though my insides are on fire, Ambrose. What's wrong with me? Could be any number of things. Cholera, though we haven't had an outbreak this season. Dysentery, though your symptoms aren't quite right. Perhaps a stomach fever of some kind. Dr. Fenwick stroked his whiskers thoughtfully. I'll prescribe calomel and castor oil. Bloodletting might also prove beneficial, purge the system of whatever toxins have taken hold. Alfred's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Bloodletting. As if Cornelius hadn't been bled enough already, though not in the way the doctor intended. Still, he said nothing. Silence was his greatest weapon, his most reliable disguise. Dr. Fenwick examined Temperance next, then Zebediah, and arrived at largely the same conclusions: mysterious stomach ailment, cause unknown, treatment uncertain. He left behind bottles of foul-smelling medicine and instructions to avoid rich foods, drink plenty of water, and rest. Then he departed with his fee, $2 for the house call, another $1 for the medicines, leaving the Blackridge family no closer to understanding what was slowly destroying them from within. That night, Alfred ground more bones in the basement kitchen. The sound had become almost meditative, a rhythm that matched his heartbeat: grind and turn, pulverize and reduce. He'd moved on to a second skeleton now, the first had been nearly exhausted. This one he'd found deeper in the cemetery, in the oldest section where the earth was black and rich with decay. The bones had been more brittle, easier to break, as if death had made them eager to transform. He thought about Mercy while he worked. Always Mercy. Her laugh, which had sounded like water over stones. Her hands, so skilled at the spinning wheel despite being only 14. The way she'd called him Papa, in that soft voice that made his chest ache with love and terror because he knew, always knew, that she could be taken from him at any moment. And she had been. Worked to death in the cotton fields while he'd been inside polishing silver and serving soup, unable to protect her, unable to even mourn her properly. The bone ash fell like snow into the porcelain bowl. White and fine and absolutely merciless. If you're enjoying this descent into darkness, subscribe to stay updated on more macabre tales from history. Drop a comment below, would you have suspected the truth? By the second week, the symptoms had evolved into something more sinister. Cornelius's hair began to fall out. Not all at once, but in disturbing quantities, clumps of it left on his pillow each morning, strands collecting in his brush until Temperance ordered it burned and a new one purchased. His teeth loosened in his gums, making it painful to eat anything but soft foods. Alfred took to preparing broths and custards, each one laced with precisely measured amounts of bone ash that Cornelius consumed without question, grateful for anything his ravaged stomach could tolerate. Temperance developed tremors in her hands that made her unable to hold a teacup without spilling. Her headaches intensified until she could barely stand light or sound, spending her days in a darkened bedroom with the curtains drawn and a vinegar-soaked cloth pressed to her forehead. Her skin took on a grayish pallor that no amount of rouge could disguise. When Charleston society ladies came to call, she refused to see them, claiming fatigue but really hiding the fact that she'd become a ghost of herself. Zebediah suffered the worst, perhaps because his constitution had been weakened by years of alcohol abuse. The vomiting became so severe he could barely keep down water. His eyes yellowed, his body wasted, and his temper, never pleasant to begin with, became absolutely feral. He accused the servants of poisoning him, ironically enough, though he blamed Delilah and the kitchen staff rather than Alfred. Once, he grabbed Ruth by the arm hard enough to bruise and screamed in her face about incompetence and conspiracy. Alfred had intervened with quiet authority, gently but firmly removing Zebediah's hand from the terrified girl's arm. "Master Zebediah, you're unwell," Alfred had said, his voice calm as still water. "Perhaps you should return to bed. I'll bring you some chamomile tea." Zebediah had stared at him with bloodshot eyes, suspicion and confusion warring across his ravaged features. But he'd allowed Alfred to guide him back upstairs, allowed him to tuck him into bed like a child, allowed him to bring the poison tea that would ensure his continued suffering. Only after Zebediah had drunk half the cup did Alfred allow himself a moment of dark satisfaction. This was the man who'd raped and murdered Mercy. Alfred knew it now with absolute certainty. 3 nights prior, in the depths of fever delirium, Zebediah had confessed everything. Alfred had been changing the bedsheets when Zebediah's eyes had suddenly focused on him with terrible clarity. The girl, Zebediah had whispered, his voice hoarse. The one from the quarters. I didn't mean to kill her. She wouldn't stop fighting. I wouldn't stop screaming. I had to make her quiet. Alfred's hands had frozen on the sheets. What girl, Master Zebediah? Mercy. That was her name, wasn't it? Your daughter. Zebediah's laugh was wet and horrible. Father paid off the overseer. Told everyone she died from exhaustion. But I saw her face when she stopped breathing. I see it every night now. Every time I close my eyes. The confession hung in the air between them, terrible and irrevocable. Alfred had finished tucking in the sheets with hands that didn't shake, couldn't shake, wouldn't shake, and said nothing. What was there to say? That he'd already known. That he'd seen Zebediah leaving the quarters that night, had seen the way Mercy had changed afterward, had become silent and hollow. That her death 3 weeks later had been both shocking and inevitable. You're feverish, Master Zebediah, Alfred had said quietly. You should rest. And he'd left the room before the rage building in his chest could explode into violence. Left before his hands could wrap around Zebediah's throat and squeeze the confession back down into his worthless body. Left because patience was the only weapon he had, and he wouldn't waste it on the quick satisfaction of murder when slow poisoning was so much more appropriate. Since that night, Alfred had doubled Zebediah's dosage. Dr. Fenwick returned at the end of the 2nd week, summoned by an increasingly desperate Temperance who'd managed to pen a barely legible note. He examined the family again, this time with less confidence and more confusion. I've never seen anything quite like this, he admitted, standing in the hallway outside Cornelius's room with Temperance and Alfred. The symptoms are consistent with arsenic poisoning, but there's no source I can identify. Have you changed anything in the household? New cookware? New medicines? Nothing, Temperance insisted, her voice breaking. Nothing has changed. We eat the same foods we've always eaten, drink from the same well, use the same products. What's happening to us, Doctor? Dr. Fenwick pulled at his whiskers, a nervous gesture that betrayed his helplessness. I'll consult with my colleagues in Charleston. Perhaps someone has encountered something similar. In the meantime, continue with the calomel, and I'm going to prescribe milk thistle for the liver symptoms. Avoid all rich foods, no alcohol, plenty of rest. We've been doing all of that, Temperance said, and Alfred heard the desperation bleeding through her usually composed voice. Nothing helps. My husband can barely walk. My eldest son looks like a corpse. What if we're cursed, Doctor? What if something evil has taken hold of this house? Nonsense, Dr. Fenwick said firmly, though Alfred caught the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. This is a medical matter, not a supernatural one. I'll return in 3 days with a second opinion from Dr. Whitmore. Until then, try to keep your spirits up. Anxiety can worsen any physical ailment. After the doctor left, Temperance stood in the hallway for a long moment, one trembling hand pressed to her mouth. Alfred waited at a respectful distance, ready to assist if needed but giving her the space to collect herself. When she finally turned to him, her eyes were red-rimmed and desperate. Alfred, you've been with this family for over 20 years. Have you noticed anything unusual? Anything at all that might explain this? Alfred met her gaze steadily, his face a mask of concern. Nothing, Mistress Temperance. I've been as vigilant as always. If there were anything amiss, I would have brought it to your attention immediately. Of course. Of course you would. She pressed her fingers to her temples. I'm simply grasping at shadows. Forgive me. There's nothing to forgive, ma'am. Your worry is natural. He paused, as if considering his next words carefully. Perhaps, if I may suggest, would it be wise to have someone test the well water? Sometimes contamination can occur without visible signs. Yes. Yes, that's sensible. Arrange it, please. Right away, ma'am. The well water would test clean, of course. Alfred had been careful to use only bone ash, nothing else. And bone dissolved completely in liquid, became indistinguishable from naturally occurring minerals. The test would show nothing, and the mystery would deepen, and the family would continue to waste away while Alfred continued to serve them with perfect, unshakable devotion. That evening, during dinner, which only Eulalie and Thaddeus attended now, the others were too ill to leave their rooms. Alfred noticed Thaddeus watching him. The boy had barely touched his soup again, had pushed it aside after 2 spoonfuls and focused instead on the bread and butter. His eyes kept drifting to Alfred, then away, then back again, as if working through some complex equation. After dinner, as Alfred was clearing the table, Thaddeus spoke. "Alfred, may I ask you something?" "Of course, Master Thaddeus." "Do you believe in divine justice? In the idea that people ultimately receive what they deserve?" The question hung in the air, loaded with meaning Alfred couldn't quite decipher. Was this innocent philosophy, or was the boy suspecting something? "I believe," Alfred said carefully, "that justice takes many forms. And that sometimes it arrives when we least expect it." Thaddeus nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "My father told me once that slaves were happy in their bondage. That it was the natural order of things. Do you think that's true?" The question was dangerous, a trap perhaps, or maybe genuine curiosity from a boy too thoughtful for his own good. Alfred chose his words with precision. "I think, Master Thaddeus, that people tell themselves many things to justify the world they've built. Whether those things are true is a question each person must answer for themselves." "That's not really an answer." "No," Alfred agreed. "It's not. But it's the only one I can give." Thaddeus studied him for another long moment, then nodded. "Thank you, Alfred. You may go." Alfred bowed slightly and withdrew, but the conversation troubled him. Thaddeus was too observant, too intelligent. And unlike the rest of his family, he seemed capable of seeing Alfred as something more than furniture. It was a complication Alfred hadn't fully anticipated. That night, alone in his small room, Alfred sat on his cot with the porcelain bowl in his lap. Moonlight spilled through the small window, illuminating the bone ash until it seemed to glow. He thought about Mercy's grave, about all the graves in the cemetery, about the bones he'd been grinding for 2 weeks now. How many people had contributed to this powder? How many lives are reduced to dust? And he thought about Zebediah's confession, which had confirmed what Alfred's heart had known but his mind had refused to accept. His daughter hadn't just died. She'd been murdered. And her murderer had gone unpunished, protected by money and status and a father willing to cover up any sin to preserve the family name. Well. Not anymore. Alfred dipped his finger into the ash and brought it to his lips. It tasted of nothing, chalk and emptiness and the absolute neutrality of death. This was justice, he told himself. This was righteousness. This was what happened when the law failed and God looked away and the only person left to balance the scales was a man with steady hands and infinite patience. He sealed the bowl and hid it behind the flour sacks. Tomorrow, he will add more ash to the family's breakfast. And the day after that, and the day after that, until the Blackridge family was nothing but memory and ash themselves, returned to the earth they'd profited from, consumed by the bones of those they'd consumed. Outside, an owl called in the darkness. In the cemetery, the dead rested in their unmarked graves. And in the basement kitchen of the Blackridge estate, Alfred Thorne sat in the shadows and waited for morning, when he would once again serve death on silver plates to the family that had taken everything from him. Justice, he had learned, was patient. And so was he. The cemetery had become Alfred's cathedral, the place where he went to conduct his most sacred work. 3 weeks into the poisoning, he had established a routine as precise and ritualistic as any religious observance. Every third night, when the moon was bright enough to work by but the household was deep in sleep, he would slip from his small room with a canvas sack tucked under his arm and make his way through the magnolia grove to the forgotten burial ground beyond. The path was familiar now, worn smooth by his repeated journeys. Spanish moss hung from the live oaks like funeral shrouds, swaying in the night breeze with a whisper that sounded almost like voices. Alfred had stopped being frightened by the sounds of the cemetery, the rustle of palmetto fronds, the call of night birds, the occasional splash from the nearby creek. If there were ghosts here, they were his witnesses, his congregation, his silent accomplices in the work of justice. Tonight the air was thick with the smell of jasmine and rot, that peculiar southern combination of beauty and decay. Alfred moved between the graves with the confidence of long practice, his lantern casting dancing shadows across the uneven ground. There were no headstones here, no markers to distinguish one grave from another. The enslaved dead of Blackridge were buried in simple wooden boxes when there were boxes at all, wrapped in canvas when there weren't, returned to earth with no more ceremony than one might give a dead horse. Mercy's grave was near the eastern edge, beneath a twisted oak whose roots had already begun to disturb the soil. Alfred knelt beside it, setting down his lantern and pressing one hand flat against the earth. He'd developed the habit of speaking to her on these visits, though he kept his voice low and his words brief. 3 weeks now, he whispered. Zebediah is dying. The others are following. I wish you could see it, baby girl. I wish you could see them suffer the way they made you suffer. The earth offered no response, but Alfred hadn't expected one. Mercy was gone, truly gone, and no amount of vengeance would bring her back. But it might balance the scales. It might make her death mean something beyond mere statistics in Cornelius's account books. He moved to a different section of the cemetery, one he'd been working systematically for the past week. The oldest graves were here, dating back to when Cornelius's grandfather had first established the plantation. The earth was so saturated with death that it had turned black and oily, rich with the decomposed remains of people whose names had been forgotten before they'd even been buried. Alfred had learned to identify promising sites by the slight depression in the ground, the way certain patches of soil felt different under his spade, looser, more yielding, ready to give up their secrets. He began to dig, his movements economical and practiced. The first foot was easy, loose topsoil that parted readily. The second foot required more effort, the clay becoming denser, more resistant. At 3 feet, his spade struck something solid with a hollow thunk that echoed through the quiet night. Bones. Alfred set aside the spade and knelt in the shallow hole he'd created, using his hands to brush away the remaining dirt. The skeleton was incomplete, ribs mostly, and what looked like part of a pelvis. The rest had either decomposed entirely or been scattered by burrowing animals over the decades. He selected the largest rib, brushing off the clinging soil with careful fingers. It was surprisingly light, porous and delicate, stained dark brown by years in the ground. As he worked, a sound made him freeze, footsteps, approaching through the magnolia grove. Alfred's heart hammered against his ribs. He doused the lantern immediately, plunging himself into darkness, and crouched low in the grave he'd been excavating. The footsteps came closer, accompanied by the crackle of broken twigs and the rustle of disturbed undergrowth. Someone was out here. Someone had followed him. Through the trees, a light appeared, another lantern, swinging in rhythm with the walker's gait. Alfred pressed himself against the side of the grave, his hand closing around the rib bone as if it might serve as a weapon. His mind raced through possibilities. If it was the overseer, he could claim he'd come to pay respects to his daughter. If it was Zebediah, but no, Zebediah was too ill to leave his bed. If it was Cornelius. Alfred? I know you're here. The voice stopped him cold. Not Cornelius. Not the overseer. Thaddeus. The young master emerged from the magnolia grove, his lantern held high, his face pale in the yellow light. He wore a nightshirt and boots, hastily dressed, and his expression was a mixture of fear and determination that made him look younger than his 16 years. I saw you leave from my bedroom window, Thaddeus said, approaching slowly. This is the 3rd time I've watched you come out here in the middle of the night. What are you doing, Alfred? For a long moment, Alfred considered his options. He could lie, claim he'd been unable to sleep and had come to visit Mercy's grave. But Thaddeus was standing 10 feet from the hole Alfred had been digging, and could see the displaced earth and the canvas sack and the suspicious bulge where Alfred had tucked the rib bone against his body. Go back to the house, Master Thaddeus, Alfred said quietly, climbing out of the grave. This doesn't concern you. My family is dying, Thaddeus said, and his voice cracked. Father can barely stand. Zebediah looks like a corpse. Mother shakes so badly she can't hold a pen. And you're out here digging up bones in the middle of the night. He paused, his breath coming quick and shallow. Dr. Fenwick said the symptoms looked like arsenic poisoning. But we don't have arsenic in the house. I checked. I went through every cabinet, every storage room. There's no arsenic. Alfred's hands remained steady at his sides, though his mind was calculating distances, possibilities, the likelihood that he could overpower the boy if necessary. But looking at Thaddeus's face, frightened and confused and somehow still trusting, he found he couldn't quite bring himself to consider violence. Not against this one. Not against the boy who'd called him by name since he was 7 years old. You should go back, Alfred repeated. But there are other poisons, Thaddeus continued, as if Alfred hadn't spoken. I've been reading Father's medical books. Phosphorus can cause similar symptoms. Lead. Mercury. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thin throat. And a bone meal. Ground bone, consumed in sufficient quantities over time, can cause acute phosphorus poisoning. The symptoms match perfectly: the vomiting, the hair loss, the tooth decay, the tremors. The night seemed to contract around them, the air growing thick and heavy. Alfred stood perfectly still, his face revealing nothing. I didn't want to believe it, Thaddeus whispered. I told myself I was being paranoid. That I was seeing patterns where none existed. But then I watched you tonight, followed you here, and I see what you're doing. He gestured to the grave, to the disturbed earth, to the canvas sack. You're grinding up bones. And you're feeding them to my family. Yes, Alfred said simply. There seemed no point in denying it now. Thaddeus took a step backward, the lantern swaying in his trembling hand. Why? I've never, he stopped, his face crumpling. Is it because of Mercy? Alfred's jaw tightened. You know what happened to her. I know she died in the fields. Father said it was exhaustion, that she'd been sickly. Your brother raped her, Alfred said, his voice flat and pitiless. Held her down behind the gin house and raped her. When she fought back, when she screamed, he strangled her to keep her quiet. She was 14 years old. She was my daughter. And your father paid the overseer to bury her quickly and list her death as natural causes. Thaddeus's face had gone white as bone. No. Zebediah wouldn't. He confessed it to me, Alfred continued, each word precise as a knife cut. 3 nights ago, in his delirium. Told me everything. How she fought. How she died. How your father covered it up to protect the family name. He paused, letting the words settle. So yes, Master Thaddeus. It's because of Mercy. It's because your family murdered my daughter and faced no consequences. It's because in this world, people like me have no recourse to justice except what we can take for ourselves. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the wind through the live oaks and the distant call of a whippoorwill. Thaddeus stood frozen, the lantern casting wild shadows across his face as his hand continued to shake. I didn't know, he finally said, his voice barely audible. I swear to God, Alfred, I didn't know. If I had, if I'd suspected. What would you have done? Alfred asked, and the question wasn't accusatory, merely curious. Would you have turned in your own brother? Contradicted your father? Testified on behalf of a slave girl against your own blood? Thaddeus opened his mouth, then closed it again. They both knew the answer. I stopped eating the soup, Thaddeus said after a moment. 2 weeks ago, I noticed you never touched it yourself. You'd serve it, but you never ate it. And I remembered my chemistry lessons, how some poisons could be rendered tasteless, especially when dissolved in liquids or mixed with strongly flavored foods. So I stopped eating anything I saw you prepare alone. I know, Alfred said. I noticed. But you didn't increase my dosage in other foods. You could have. You could have hidden it in my tea or my bread or anything else. But you didn't. Why? Alfred was quiet for a long moment, listening to the night sounds of the cemetery. Because you were 7 years old when I came to this house. Because you asked me questions and listened to my answers. Because you said please and thank you. Because in 23 years of service, you're the only member of your family who ever treated me like I was human. He met Thaddeus's eyes. It's a weakness, I know. But I couldn't kill you. Not you. Thaddeus's face twisted with emotion, grief, guilt, horror, something else Alfred couldn't quite identify. So what happens now? You continue poisoning my family until they're all dead. And then what? The authorities will investigate. They'll find evidence. You'll hang. Perhaps, Alfred said. Or perhaps the good Dr. Fenwick will continue to be baffled, will rule it a mysterious epidemic of swamp fever or cholera. Disease claims plantation families all the time in the lowcountry. No one investigates too closely. But I know, Thaddeus said desperately. I know what you're doing. I could tell them. I could, he stopped, his expression crumbling. But I won't. God help me, I won't. The admission hung between them, terrible and binding. Why? Alfred asked softly. Thaddeus's laugh was bitter and broken. Because you're right. Because Zebediah is a monster. Because father would absolutely cover up a murder to protect the family reputation, I've seen him do it before, with other things. Because mother turns a blind eye to everything that would disturb her comfortable worldview. Because my entire family is built on a foundation of human suffering, and I've benefited from it every day of my life without ever having the courage to do anything about it. Tears tracked down his cheeks now, silver in the lantern light. Because maybe they do deserve this. Maybe I deserve it too. You've stopped eating my cooking, Alfred pointed out. You're protecting yourself. I was protecting myself, Thaddeus corrected. But standing here now, knowing what I know, he took a shuddering breath. Finish it, Alfred. Do what you came here to do. They deserve it. God knows they deserve it. Alfred stared at the boy, this young master who stood in a graveyard confessing complicity in his own family's murder. And you? I've been writing everything down, Thaddeus said. Every suspicion, every observation, every piece of evidence. I have it hidden in the library, sealed in an envelope. A confession of sorts, though I'm confessing to crimes I didn't commit. When this is over, when they're gone, that confession will surface. It will say that I poisoned them. That I was driven mad by guilt over my family's sins. That you're innocent. They'll never believe it. They will if I'm dead when they find it, Thaddeus said simply. The words dropped like stones into still water, sending ripples of implication across the surface of the night. Alfred felt something cold settle in his chest, something that might have been horror or might have been recognition. No, he said firmly. I won't let you. You won't be able to stop me, Thaddeus interrupted. I'll wait until it's finished. Until they're gone. And then I'll do what needs to be done to ensure you go free. He smiled, a sad, strange expression that made him look ancient despite his youth. Consider it my penance. My one decent act in a lifetime of comfortable evil. Alfred wanted to argue, wanted to refuse this terrible gift, but he found he had no words. The boy before him had transformed in moments from complication to accomplice to something else entirely, martyr, perhaps, or co-conspirator in a plot more elaborate than Alfred had ever imagined. Go back to the house, Master Thaddeus, Alfred finally said. And eat whatever I serve you tomorrow. I won't add anything to your portion. I swear it. Thaddeus nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. One question, Alfred. Do you believe in ghosts? Alfred glanced around the cemetery, at the unmarked graves and the twisted oaks and the Spanish moss that moved in the breeze like restless spirits. I believe the dead are with us, he said carefully. Whether that makes them ghosts or merely memory, I couldn't say. I hope they are, Thaddeus said softly. I hope Mercy is watching. I hope all of them are watching. I hope they see justice done, even if it comes too late. He turned and walked back through the magnolia grove, his lantern swinging, his footsteps fading into the darkness. Alfred stood alone in the cemetery, the rib bone still clutched in his hand, and felt the weight of everything that had just transpired settle onto his shoulders like a shroud. The dead were indeed watching. Alfred could feel their presence all around him, patient and waiting. And tomorrow, he would continue grinding their bones, would continue serving death to the Blackridge family, but now with the knowledge that he wasn't working alone. He had an accomplice. A witness. A boy willing to die to ensure that justice, however dark and twisted it had become, would prevail. Alfred knelt and carefully placed the rib bone in his canvas sack. Then he filled in the grave, smoothed the earth, and made his way back through the magnolia grove toward the house. Behind him, the cemetery settled into silence, its secrets temporarily undisturbed, its bones waiting patiently to be called upon again. Justice, Alfred had learned, required patience. And sacrifice. And sometimes, the complicity of the innocent. The fourth week brought death to Blackridge estate, though not in the order Alfred had anticipated. Zebediah died first, on a Tuesday morning when the mockingbirds were singing in the magnolia trees and the air smelled of honeysuckle and decay. Alfred found him when he brought the morning tea, a courtesy he'd continued even as Zebediah wasted away, even as the young master's body became a landscape of jutting bones and yellowed skin. Zebediah lay in his bed with his eyes open and glassy, his mouth twisted in a final grimace of agony, one hand clutched to his stomach as if he could hold his failing organs in place through will alone. Alfred stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring at the corpse of his daughter's murderer. He'd expected to feel satisfaction, triumph, the hot rush of vindication. Instead, he felt only a hollow emptiness, as if the revenge he'd worked so carefully to orchestrate had carved out something essential from inside him and left nothing but void in its place. Is he? Thaddeus appeared behind Alfred, his face pale, his voice barely a whisper. Yes, Master Thaddeus. He's gone. Thaddeus moved past Alfred into the room, approaching his brother's body with hesitant steps. He reached out, touched Zebediah's forehead, then pulled his hand back quickly as if burned. He's still warm. It was recent, then. Within the hour. Alfred kept his voice professionally neutral, the tone of a servant reporting a household matter rather than the architect of a murder describing his handiwork. I should get Mother, Thaddeus said, but he didn't move. He stood staring at his brother's corpse, his expression unreadable. He confessed, didn't he? About Mercy. In his delirium. Yes. Did he ask for forgiveness? Alfred considered lying, and offered the boy some comfort in the form of false redemption. But Thaddeus had become his accomplice in this dark work, and accomplices deserve truth. No. He bragged about it. Laughed, even. Said she'd been too pretty to resist. Thaddeus's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists at his sides. Then I'm glad he's dead. God help me, I'm glad. The funeral was held 3 days later, a grand affair that half of Charleston society attended. The minister spoke eloquently about Zebediah's promising future, cut short by tragic illness. He praised the young man's spirit, his vitality, his devotion to family and tradition. Alfred stood in the back of the church with the other house servants, listening to this fiction being woven around a rapist and murderer, and felt the bone ash in his pocket like a talisman. Justice might be blind, but at least it was thorough. Cornelius tried to laugh, but it came out as a wet, rattling cough. Blood flecked his lips. Then I've failed, as a father. Failed to teach him, that family loyalty, is everything. No, Alfred said softly. You taught him exactly what family loyalty meant in this house. You taught him that it meant covering up rape and murder. That it meant valuing reputation over truth. That it meant treating human beings as property. He learned those lessons well. And he rejected them. Cornelius's breathing grew more shallow, more labored. His eyes began to glaze, focusing on something beyond Alfred, beyond the room, beyond the world of the living. The faces, he whispered. In the walls. Just like Temperance said. They're watching. They're waiting. Yes, Alfred agreed. They're waiting to welcome you to whatever comes next. Cornelius Blackridge died at noon, with Alfred standing witness beside his bed. The master of Blackridge estate, owner of 400 acres and 63 human souls, died knowing exactly what had killed him and why. Alfred closed the man's eyes and arranged his body properly, maintaining the fiction of the devoted servant even in this final act. Then he walked downstairs to find Thaddeus in the library, seated at his father's desk with an envelope in his hands. It's done, Alfred said simply. Thaddeus looked up, his face pale but composed. All of them? Yes. All of them. The boy, because despite everything, he was still just a boy, nodded slowly. He held up the envelope. My confession. Everything written out, sealed, addressed to Marshal Kane. When they find my body, they'll find this too. You'll be free, Alfred. I promise. You don't have to do this, Alfred said, though he knew it was pointless. Yes, Thaddeus replied, I do. For Mercy. For all of them. He paused. And for myself. I can't live in this house, knowing what I know, being who I am. The son of a monster, the brother of a rapist, the inheritor of blood money and human suffering. This is the only decent thing I'll ever do. Let me do it. Alfred stood in the doorway, looking at this strange boy who'd become his accomplice, his witness, his unexpected ally in the pursuit of terrible justice. "Thank you," he said finally. "For believing me. For helping me." "I didn't help you," Thaddeus said. "I just didn't stop you. There's a difference. Not as much of one as you might think." Thaddeus managed a small, sad smile. "Go, Alfred. Leave this place. You've earned your freedom, even if the law will never grant it officially. Go north. Find a new life. Forget Blackridge ever existed." But Alfred knew he would never forget. The bone ash, the grinding sound, the taste of revenge, these things were burned into his soul now, permanent and indelible. He would carry Blackridge with him wherever he went, along with Mercy's memory and the weight of 4 deaths that might have been justice or might have been murder or might have been both simultaneously. He nodded once to Thaddeus, then turned and walked away, leaving the boy alone in the library with his envelope and his fate. Behind him, the Blackridge estate settled into its final silence, a tomb now rather than a home, filled with ghosts and bone ash and the terrible price of justice served cold. The authorities arrived on a Wednesday morning, 5 days after Cornelius Blackridge's death. Marshal Beauregard Kane rode up the oak-lined avenue with 2 deputies, their horses' hooves clopping against packed earth that had been watered by the sweat and blood of generations. Alfred watched them from the kitchen window, his face impassive, his hands occupied with polishing silver that would never again serve a Blackridge meal. The house had become a mausoleum. Sheets covered the furniture in rooms where no one would ever sit again. The mirrors were draped in black crepe, though there was no one left to observe the proper mourning traditions. Most of the servants had fled in the days following Cornelius's death, frightened by the pall of mortality that hung over the estate like fog off the Ashley River. Only Alfred remained, along with Delilah and old Josiah, and they stayed more out of uncertainty than loyalty. Where could they go? What could they do? They were enslaved people whose master had died without making provisions for their future. Marshal Kane was a broad man with a cavalry mustache and eyes that had seen too much of the worst humanity had to offer. He dismounted heavily, his boots striking the ground with authority, and approached the front door where Alfred stood waiting. "You the butler?" Kane asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Yes, sir. Alfred Thorne. I need to see the bodies. All of them. And I need to speak with any surviving family members." Alfred's throat tightened. "There's only one, sir. Master Thaddeus. The youngest son. He's in his room upstairs." Kane's eyebrows rose. "One survivor out of 5? That's some plague you had here." "Yes, sir. It came on suddenly. Dr. Fenwick attended them, but nothing helped. We'll see about that." Kane gestured to his deputies. "Search the house. Look for anything unusual. Medicines, chemicals, anything that might explain 4 deaths in 4 weeks." He turned back to Alfred. "Show me to the boys' room." Alfred led them upstairs, his heart beating a steady rhythm that matched his footsteps. The bone ash was hidden behind the flour sacks in the basement kitchen, but how thoroughly would they search? And what would they find if they tested it? Would they recognize ground human bone for what it was? Thaddeus's door was closed. Alfred knocked softly. "Master Thaddeus? The marshal is here." No response. Alfred knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Kane pushed past him and tried the handle, locked from the inside. "Break it down," Kane ordered. One of the deputies put his shoulder to the door. It took 3 attempts before the lock gave way, the door swinging inward to reveal Thaddeus Blackridge's final act. The boy hung from the ceiling beam, a rope around his neck, his face peaceful despite the violence of his death. His chair lay toppled beneath him, evidence of the moment he'd stepped off into eternity. And on the desk below, arranged with careful precision, lay a sealed envelope addressed to Marshal Beauregard Kane. "Jesus Christ," one of the deputies whispered. Kane moved into the room with grim efficiency, checking Thaddeus's body, cold, dead several hours at least, before turning his attention to the envelope. He broke the seal and began to read, his face growing darker with each line. Alfred stood in the doorway, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the marshal's expression shift from confusion to horror to grim understanding. He knew what the letter said. Thaddeus had shown it to him the night before, had read it aloud in a voice that never wavered. To Marshal Kane and any other authorities who may read this. I, Thaddeus Cornelius Blackridge, being of sound mind and guilty conscience, do hereby confess to the murder of my family. For 4 weeks, I administered slow poison to my father, mother, brother, and sister, watching them waste away as punishment for crimes too numerous and terrible to fully enumerate here. My brother Zebediah raped and murdered a young enslaved girl named Mercy Thorne. My father covered up this crime to protect the family reputation. My mother turned blind eyes to countless cruelties. My sister benefited from a system built on human suffering. And I said nothing. Did nothing. Allowed it all to continue because comfort was easier than conscience. So I poisoned them. Ground phosphorus from matches, carefully collected and administered in their food over weeks. I studied chemistry, you see. I knew how to make it slow, how to make it look like disease. The servants of this house are innocent. Especially Alfred Thorne, Mercy's father, who has served with loyalty and grace despite everything this family took from him. He suspected nothing. None of them did. By the time you read this, I will have joined my family in whatever hell awaits us. This is my penance. My final act. Let it be enough. Thaddeus Blackridge, April 30th, 1852. Kane read the letter twice, his jaw working silently. Then he looked up at Alfred, his eyes searching. This boy confessed to killing his whole family. Says he used phosphorus. Says you knew nothing about it. I knew nothing, sir, Alfred said, and his voice didn't waver because he'd spent 43 years learning how to lie to white men without lying. Master Thaddeus was quiet, kept to himself. I never suspected. Phosphorus poisoning, Kane said slowly. Symptoms match, I suppose. Vomiting, hair loss, decay. Nasty way to die. He folded the letter and tucked it into his coat. We'll need to search the house anyway. Procedure. But if we find phosphorus or match heads or evidence supporting this confession, the case is closed. Tragic family murder-suicide. Nothing more to investigate. The deputies searched for 3 hours. They found Thaddeus's chemistry set in the library, his medical books with certain pages marked, a box of matches in his desk drawer. They found Dr. Fenwick's records documenting the family's decline. They found everything that supported Thaddeus's confession and nothing that contradicted it. They never searched the basement kitchen thoroughly enough to find the bone ash behind the flour sacks. Terrible thing, Kane said as he prepared to leave. But clear enough. The boy confessed, the evidence supports it, and there's no reason to doubt his word. He paused, looking at Alfred with an expression that might have been sympathy or might have been suspicion. You'll need to report to the county courthouse. With the family dead and no will leaving provisions for the enslaved, you'll all be sold at auction to settle the estate debts. Alfred nodded, keeping his face neutral even as something cold settled in his stomach. Free from the Blackridge family, only to be sold to another master. Justice had its limits. But Kane wasn't finished. Unless. He pulled out the letter again, scanning it. Unless someone wants to honor the boy's last wishes. He wrote here that you served loyally despite everything. That's worth something. I might be able to arrange papers. Not official manumission, but close enough. Get you north where they won't ask too many questions. Alfred stared at the marshal, unable to quite believe what he was hearing. Sir. The boy killed himself to protect you, Kane said quietly. The least I can do is make sure his death means something. You want freedom, Alfred Thorne. Real freedom? Yes, sir, Alfred whispered. More than anything. Then you'll have it. Give me 2 days to arrange the papers. You'll travel north as a free-colored man, and God help anyone who questions it. Before we continue with the horrifying conclusion, hit that subscribe button if you crave more true horror stories. Comment your theories, how do you think this ends? 2 days later, Alfred Thorne walked through the slave cemetery one final time. He carried the porcelain bowl in his hands, still half full of bone ash that would never be used. The morning was gray and cool, threatening rain, and Spanish moss swayed in the breeze like mourners at a graveside. He knelt at Mercy's unmarked grave, the earth still slightly mounded despite 3 months of settling. The bone ash looked like snow in his dark hands, innocent and pure despite what it represented. 4 deaths. 4 lives taken in exchange for one. Was that justice? Was that balance? Or was it simply revenge dressed in righteous clothing? I did it, baby girl, Alfred whispered, his voice breaking for the first time in weeks. I made them pay. Every last one of them. And I'm free now. Free to leave this place. Free to live. Tears tracked down his face, hot and unexpected. But it doesn't bring you back. It doesn't change anything that matters. He poured the remaining bone ash onto her grave, watching it scatter across the dark earth like a benediction or a curse. The dead were finally released from service, no longer required to exact vengeance on his behalf. They could rest now. All of them could rest. Alfred stood, brushed the ash from his hands, and turned away from the cemetery for the last time. Behind him, the Blackridge estate loomed against the gray sky, its white columns already beginning to show signs of decay. The property would be sold, probably split up, the slave quarters torn down or repurposed. Within a generation, no one would remember the family that had lived here, the people they'd enslaved, or the terrible price that had been paid for injustice. But Alfred would remember. Every grinding sound, every spoonful of poison, every death would be burned into his memory forever. He would carry Mercy with him, and Thaddeus, and the weight of what he'd done. Freedom came with a cost, and he would pay it for the rest of his life. At the edge of the property, Marshal Kane waited with papers that declared Alfred Thorne a free man. They were forgeries, technically illegal, but they would serve. They would get him north, would give him a chance at a life he'd never imagined possible. Ready? Kane asked, handing over the documents. Alfred took them, feeling their weight, lighter than bone ash, heavier than chains. Yes, sir. I'm ready. He climbed into the wagon that would take him to Charleston, then to a ship bound for Philadelphia, then to whatever future awaited him in the north. As they pulled away, he looked back one last time at Blackridge Estate, at the Magnolia Grove, at the cemetery hidden beyond it. The house looked smaller already, less imposing, just a structure of brick and wood that would eventually crumble like everything else. In the end, justice hadn't been served. Justice would have meant Mercy living, Thaddeus growing old, a world where enslaved people were free and rapists faced consequences. What Alfred had achieved was something else, vengeance, perhaps, or retribution, or simply the only response available to a man with no power except the power to make his oppressors suffer. Was it right? Was it wrong? Alfred no longer knew. The bone ash had poisoned more than just the Blackridge family. It had poisoned something essential in his own soul, had transformed grief into something cold and calculating and utterly without mercy. But Mercy was still dead. And Alfred was free. And somewhere between those two facts lay a truth too complicated for words, too dark for easy judgment. The wagon rolled down the oak-lined avenue, carrying Alfred Thorne away from the only home he'd known for 23 years. Behind him, the Blackridge estate stood empty and silent, a monument to pride and cruelty and the terrible things that happen when people treat other people as property. And in the basement kitchen, behind the flour sacks, a porcelain bowl sat empty and clean, waiting for a use that would never come. The grinding stone rested on its shelf, innocent of any wrongdoing, just a tool that had served its purpose and been returned to storage. The dead kept their secrets. The living moved on. And justice, whatever that word meant, remained as elusive as it had always been. If this story left you unsettled, subscribe for more macabre horror from history's darkest corners. Share your thoughts in the comments, justice or murder? Where do you draw the line?